それでは、開会に先立ちましていくつか、ご連絡をさせていただきます。まず最初に、お手元にある通訳機器の、使い方ですけれども、こちら前のところにですね、シルバーの丸いボタンがあります。そちらを押していただきますと、電源が入ります。その上で、左側のボタンを押していただきますと、チャンネルが1が日本語、2が英語というふうに切り替わるようになっていますので、ご確認いただければと思います。また右側のボタンはボリュームになっておりますので、そちらでボリュームを適宜ご調整ください。
First, I'd like to explain how to use the interpretation device. If you look at the surface of the device, you can see a round-shaped button in silver. And if you push the button, the device will be turned on. And then on your right side, you'll see the buttons with which you can change the channel for English or Japanese. The channel 1 is Japanese, and channel 2 is English. And you can use the button on the left side to change the volume.
オンラインでご参加の方々につきましては、スクリーンの下に同時通訳の切り替えボタンがありますので、そちらをご利用いただければと思います。
For those of you who are attending this session online, please use the button at the bottom of the screen, and you can change the channel for simultaneous interpretation for English and Japanese.
なお、本日のご講演会につきましては、録画の上、後日配信させていただく予定ですので、よろしければそちらもご利用いただければと思います。はい、それでは、時間になりましたので、これから、国連開発計画 UNDP 総裁講演会の、開始させていただきます。私、本日司会を務めさせていただきます、一橋大学グローバル連携担当副学長補佐の大林和弘と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。本講演会では、2030年に向けて持続可能な未来のための創造的アプローチについて、UNDP 総裁と語らうと題しまして、2030年に期限を迎える SDGs の達成に向けたUNDP と日本の活動や戦略について、シュタイナー UNDP 総裁にお話しいただきます。なお、本講演会は UNDP と一橋大学法学研究科グローバルガバナンス研究センターで共催させていただいています。また、開催にあたりまして、一橋大学 OB 会の除水会に協賛いただいております。ご支援に感謝申し上げます。それではまず最初に一橋大学の中野聡学長よりご挨拶させていただきます。中野学長、よろしくお願いいたします。
ご来場の皆様、本日は国連開発計画 UNDP 総裁講演会に対面およびオンラインでご参加いただき誠にありがとうございます。一橋大学学長の中野聡でございます。一橋大学としてシュタイナー UNDP 総裁をお迎えできたことを大変に光栄に思います。本日の特別な機会を設けていただきましたシュタイナー総裁には心より感謝申し上げます。シュタイナー総裁は国連開発計画 UNDP 総裁として2017年に就任され、現在は2期目を務めておられます。総裁は持続可能な開発目標 SDGs を推進する国連持続可能な開発グループの副議長も兼任され、地球規模の課題解決に向けたリーダーとして活躍されております。また、国連環境計画 UNEP 事務局長時代には、クリーン技術や再生可能エネルギーの普及を牽引され、環境保全と持続可能な発展に多大な貢献をなされてきました。本日総裁は、日本の政府開発援助 ODA が1954年に開始されてから70周年を記念する外務省国際協力機構 JICA UNDP 共催のシンポジウムに参加され、基調講演、パネリスト、閉会挨拶をこなした後、本会場においでいただきました。改めて感謝申し上げます。来年創立150周年を迎える一橋大学は、長年にわたり社会科学の研究と教育を通じて国際的な課題に取り組む人材を育成してまいりました。国連や多くの国際機関で本学出身者が幹部や専門職員として活躍しており、本学卒業生の中には UNDP で重要な役職を歴任された方々や、開発途上国の現場で SDGs の達成に向けて奮闘されている方々がいます。これは本学の大いに誇りとするところであります。本日の講演会には、国際協力や国際開発分野での活躍を目指す多くの学生も参加しています。一橋大学では2021年に UNDP との学術交流協定を締結し、学生が国際機関の現場を体験できるインターンシップの機会を提供してまいりました。また SDGs をテーマにした講義やトークセッションを通じて次世代のグローバルリーダーの育成に力を注いでいます。この講演会を通じて学生たちが国際社会での役割をより深く理解し、未来へのビジョンを広げるきっかけとなることを期待しております。本講演会の開催にあたり準備を進めてくださいました一橋大学法学研究科グローバルガバナンス研究センター、そして中谷澄江教授には深く感謝申し上げます。また本講演会に協賛いただいている如水会一橋大学同窓会の皆様にも心より御礼申し上げます。如水会は一橋大学と社会を結ぶ重要な架け橋であり、その支援によって本講演会が多くの皆様にとって意義深いものとなりました。最後に本講演会の実現にご協力いただいた UNDP 日本代表事務所並びに関係者の皆様にも感謝申し上げます。それではアヒム・シュタイナー総裁によるご講演をお楽しみください。ありがとうございました。
中野学長、ありがとうございました。続きまして、シュタイナー総裁にご講演をお願いしたいと思いますが、その前に UNDP の紹介動画がありますので、こちらをご覧ください。30秒程度の動画となります。はい、中野学長の紹介にもありましたけれども、シュタイナー総裁は、国連システムにおいて40の機関が参加される、持続可能な開発グループの副議長も務めておられ、日々地球規模への課題や SDGs 達成のために世界中を飛び回っていらっしゃいます。最近ではアゼルバイジャンとサウジアラビアでの締約国会議 COP 会合にも参加されたばかりと伺っております。過去には国連環境計画 UNEP 事務局長、国連ナイロビ事務局長、国際自然保護連合 IUCN 事務局長、世界ダム委員会事務局長などの要職を歴任されており、またオックスフォード大学マーティンスクールのディレクターのご経験もお持ちです。それではシュタイナー総裁、ご講演のほどどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。Mr. Steiner, please move to the podium and give your lecture, please.
President Nakano, President of Hitotsubashi University, Professor Nakaya, and to the distinguished ladies and gentlemen who have come at this late hour here to this lecture, a warm, warm welcome. It is an honor to be here invited in your distinguished university, with whom I have not had direct contact, but indirectly, because indeed quite a number of the ambassadors and permanent representatives of Japan to the United Nations have been graduates of Hitotsubashi University. So tonight I'm delighted to be here and perhaps to stand in front of you as somebody that I hope also in our interactions in our fireside chat in a moment will be able to give you a sense of why, despite so many things not going right in the world, and so many people questioning also whether multilateralism is dying, whether the United Nations has perhaps served its time and that the world needs something else. But I don't want to look only in that direction. I want to use the very practical and very real agreements from the year 2015, namely the so-called 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, as a prism through which to look at what otherwise could be a very metaphysical debate. But Mr. President, you know, and many of your faculty and certainly students know, that we are living through a moment of time where fundamentals are being questioned. Now, this is not new in human history, but certainly at this moment in time, the geopolitical, the geoeconomic fractures in our global family of nations are deepening and in some ways more profound than they have been for decades. We live in a time where we have more conflicts, more refugees, more victims of war. We have democracies essentially struggling to succeed in many parts of the world. And we are generally facing a situation where what we once thought was a post-Cold War peace dividend, remember the 1990s, early 2000s, has suddenly given way to a world that is divided, increasingly defined by the notions of competition and conflict rather than cooperation. And so I stand before you here potentially as an anachronism, perhaps somebody who was born in a different age and does not want to recognize that the times have changed. But I actually don't believe that that is the case. Coming to Tokyo, coming this week here also on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of development cooperation in Japan's history, is to me deeply meaningful, because the story of Japan's own development cooperation is in some ways also a lens through which to look at post-war history of Japan. When Japan in 1954 began to cooperate with other nations, it itself was still rebuilding from the war. The destruction, the poverty, the desperation, the scars of a very brutal episode in Japanese history was still defining the reality for most citizens in Japan. And yet, it began to invest in development cooperation. And as I was told by Dr. Tanaka, the president of JICA, it was at that time principally a way for Japan to regain the trust of other nations. It was investing in its return to an international community, and development cooperation was the means by which Japan could engage with other countries. Now, we may just consider that a simple historical reality, but what it actually shows is something that to this day, I believe, is fundamental to why development cooperation, i.e. countries cooperating with one another and investing in one another to advance development, is not an idea whose time has gone. And it is perhaps worth reflecting, and Professor, as a historian, you may have wiser insights than I do. What has happened to our societies that in the 21st century, at a time when we face risks all around us that are not only profound, but are also very much dependent in terms of being able to manage and mitigate those risks on nations working together more than ever before. I can mention climate change, but it's not just climate change. I can mention pandemics. I can mention cybersecurity and cybercrime. I can mention poverty and migration as destabilizers. If you look at Europe's political landscape today, migration has become the single most intense dividing issue that is driving political polarization, radicalization, and to some extent even people questioning the democracies of their countries in Europe. The UNDP Human Development Report a couple of years ago talked about a democracy paradox. And what it was pointing to is that when you survey people and you ask them, do you want to live in a democratic or in an autocratic society? Everywhere in the world, most people by far said they would prefer democracy as a form of governance. But then when you ask them and you observe who people are electing today, then over 50% have indicated that they would elect autocratic leaders. And this democracy paradox is something that we need to reflect on, because it actually is pointing to something quite profound. The promise of democracy is not living up to its promise. And therefore, while people would like to choose democracy as the form of governance, they end up electing people who are actually dismantling democracy. Democracy is on the retreat around the world. And I just spent a good half hour with NHK being interviewed about what is happening. Why is UNDP investing in democratic elections? Because we are actually the UN's principal entity that supports elections. On average, once a week around the world, we are supporting national elections together with our Department of Political Affairs, because elections are fundamental to a country's governance system. Development without governance, development without effective government is not going to succeed. So it is a natural issue on which we focus. Now, you invited me this evening here for a fireside chat in a moment about, we have 5-6 years left until the year 2030. And I was there in the year 2015 when the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in the General Assembly Hall. The Pope himself was there. And Secretary General Ban Ki-moon used the phrase that day in that hall of the people, so to speak, when the SDGs were adopted, that has always accompanied me since. That 2030 Agenda was in many ways a declaration of interdependence, i.e. recognizing, acknowledging that nations are in this 21st century interdependent in being able to address the great risks of our time. And I would suggest to you that we often talk about the United Nations and the kind of objectives and goals that they define as very lofty goals that are wonderful in theory and on paper, but rarely are achieved. I would say to you, the SDGs are, yes, goals, they're lofty, but their origin is actually a very different one. It is the best possible way in which 193 nations could, first of all, articulate the greatest risks to humankind of our time. So forget about the goals, turn them into risks. And very quickly you will recognize some of the most profound risks that we face as humanity. But in developing them as goals and becoming the 2030 Agenda, we also put an emphasis on those goals and risks that would require nations to cooperate, because solving these risks or mitigating these risks would not be possible. Not even the United States of America, the largest economy in the world, can solve the climate change problem alone. Nor can it solve the problem of cyber security, cyber crime, cyber terrorism. America expends more than $800 billion on military and defense expenditure every year. Just a few months ago, when we had many of the leading representatives from countries around the world that work on national cybersecurity and cybercrime, we had a meeting in UNDP where they essentially came to us and said, whatever we will throw at this problem, all the software and all the hardware, in order to make our digital economy or ecosystem more safe and resilient, will not work unless we are able to build the institutions and capacities of every country. Because the weakest and smallest nation state in a digital ecosystem can become the Achilles heel if it doesn't have the institutions, the laws, the also policing capacity in order to protect those who will manipulate entry points into that digital ecosystem, where we can shut down entire power systems, we can enter into even electoral rolls, or we can rob the central bank of a country. These are all scenarios that are not science fiction anymore. And this was an interesting moment, because here I come back to this idea of development cooperation. The idea that we help other countries to accelerate their development has a great deal to do with who we are as human beings. It's actually a very fundamentally positive commitment to one another. But actually, we are equally also self-interested creatures. And the development cooperation reality of the 21st century is as much about empathy, generosity, solidarity, as it is about self-interest. And the ability to recognize that investing in others has immediate benefits for oneself. The 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals are a 21st century articulation of how we will all be safer, because everyone individually is also safer. And here, and I hope we will explore a little bit of that in a moment, comes also the narrative of human security that has been so central to Japan's articulation of a development cooperation vision in its own engagement with countries across the world. And UNDP and Japan have been partners in trying to articulate this notion of human security for the better part of the last 30 years, when it was first articulated in a UNDP Human Development Report. And at its core, what it essentially is saying that in the 21st century, the nature of threats and risks to our security are less and less going to be derived simply from the notion of territoriality and nation states. The great risks of our time, the great risks to humanity of the 21st century transcend national borders. The ability to minimize them, to control them, to reduce them is therefore logically also premised on the efficacy and the ability of nation states to cooperate. Human security is both a challenge to those who think that the only way to defend national security is to invest in military, armaments, and defense. I don't want to suggest that this is not a legitimate element of defending national security. But the cyber terrorist, the irresponsible management of health systems, and therefore the likelihood of a next pandemic coming, will not be defeated by tanks, by rockets, by hand grenades, or landmines. And yet, this is where today we spend $2,400 billion. This year's total military expenditure will amount to about $2,400 billion in 1 year. Our total investment in development cooperation is barely $200 billion. And yet we want to eradicate poverty, we want to solve climate change, we want to introduce the digital era, we want to make artificial intelligence the driver of development. We want to ensure that people have education, that girls go to school, and I could go on. Are we investing in a way that actually recognizes with seriousness what we have set out to do? I will leave it at that for the moment and very much look forward to our fireside chat, but let me simply end by saying, for those of you who think that multilateralism, the United Nations, or an agenda such as the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals are really an anachronism and belong to the past, I'm standing here before you as the head of an organization that I believe unequivocally belongs to the 21st century. Because in the coming years, the way we will avoid world wars and more conflicts is to actually recognize that the platform for cooperating on development is perhaps one of the most vital platforms we have for countries to be able to work together, even if they don't like each other, to put it very bluntly. The United Nations is, in a sense, underpinned by norms, but the precondition for cooperation is not always shared norms. But it will always work if you have shared interests, and that is something to debate. Thank you so much.
シュタイナー総裁、ありがとうございました。それでは続きまして2030年に向けた課題や戦略についてシュタイナー総裁に対談形式でお話を伺いたいと思いますけれども、ちょっと壇上の配置を変えさせていただきますのでしばらくお待ちください。シュタイナー総裁のお話の中では個人的にはSDGs を目標ゴールとして捉えるのではなくてリスクとして捉えるべきと、その上で対策に踏み込んでいくべきという点に非常に興味深くお話を伺いました。対談における聞き手は一橋大学森有則高等教育国際流動化機構の中谷澄江講師にお願いしています。中谷講師は国際連合の平和活動局に政務官として15年間勤務されたご経験をお持ちです。そのため本日は学術政策両面での知識経験を踏まえてご質問いただきます。なお対談の途中で頃合いを見計らって Q&A に移らせていただく予定です。シュタイナー総裁からはぜひ学生の皆さんと対応したいと、そういうメッセージをいただいておりますので、学生の皆さんからは積極的にご発言お願いできればと思います。また時間的なもしくは技術的な制約により Q&A の際の質問は対面参加の方に限らせていただきます。ご理解いただければ幸いです。それではシュタイナー総裁、中谷講師、よろしくお願いいたします。Mr. Steiner, Professor Nakaya, please move to the platform and start your dialogue.
Well, it is such a privilege to have you with us today, Mr. Steiner, and welcome everyone. I hope this is going to be fun and interactive, so let us first get to know each other. We have about 170 attending in person today, including about 70 Hitotsubashi students. Raise your hand if you're current Hitotsubashi students. So this is us. Would you raise your hand if you are former or survivors of Hitotsubashi education? Wonderful. Okay. And we also have the diplomatic ambassadors, representatives attending, and also about 100 attending online in addition, which range from, I understand, from middle school students to teachers and also people listening in from outside Tokyo. So warm welcome to everyone. And I do hope that you get to ask questions to Mr. Steiner, because I can tell you I spent 15 years in the UN in New York, and I do not meet the head of UNDP that often. So this is such a privilege, and thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to start with a few themes that you touched on. The first is the SDGs. That we have 6 years to go. I totally agree with you that SDGs are not just goals, but risks, but it's also a common language. It gave us ways to communicate and understand the challenges that we are facing today. But I also understand that only 17% of the goals have been met. So only 6 years to go left. What is it that we can do now to accelerate the progress made?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for agreeing to be a co-pilot, so to speak, in our evening fireside chat. And I would say, first of all, treat statistics with care. And I say this because two things about those 17% worry me. The first one is, yes, we agreed on targets and indicators, but then we had a pandemic. And then we had an economic, fiscal, financial, high interest, high inflation, debt crisis for many countries. So the fact that we are not where we wanted to be is now interpreted by some as essentially proof that the SDGs don't work. And I caution that conclusion because I would challenge anyone in this room here to point out one SDG that is not relevant, and in my mind, even more relevant after what we have lived through in the last 5 years. Secondly, we have a tendency, and you know this also from your time in the UN, in the United Nations, to always look for problems. So we take the SDGs, and then we don't notice that by doing our statistical magic work, which is take all the countries, put them in a bucket, and then divide all the statistics by 193, the result becomes something that has nothing to do with the reality of any individual country. What we saw during the pandemic was some extraordinary breakthroughs. For example, in social safety nets. I mean, without the pandemic, we would not have seen this maybe for another 10 to 15 years. We also saw the ability of countries to, for instance, open up access to medical treatments in a way that had never happened before. We saw the explosion of digital in a way that probably accelerated by 5 to 10 years accessibility to digital and broadband and internet simply because it became such an existential experience. I would argue even something like renewable energy is today expanding at a pace and rate that we might not have seen without COVID. So different countries made different choices, some of them remarkable in their breakthroughs, and therefore what to me the multiplicity of SDG experiences show is a lot depends on what a country chooses to do. You know, we have today countries that are producing 90% of their electricity with renewables. A few years ago, people said, that's the rich countries. Oh no, that's the big countries. Poor countries cannot afford it. Today, I can give you a country for every single scenario, and I can say, no, they did it because they chose to do it. And that, I think, is an important lesson also in looking at the SDGs. Yes, 17% is a sobering statistic. But when you unpack it, I think there is a much richer story to be told. And therefore, I think I would argue the targets and indicators have become a focus in terms of judging the value and validity of the SDGs, when in fact, I would argue, let's look at the goals. It's in the way that they have created this notion and understanding of interdependence and also the integrated approach. You can design in UNDP today a project that addresses climate change, not through SDG 13, which is about reducing emissions and so on, but actually through SDG 7, which is about access to clean and affordable energy, which is actually the UNDP development objective. But by designing an energy project with SDG 13 in mind, namely decarbonization, and SDG 1, poverty eradication, you have just created the kind of systemic approach that the SDGs are advocating. So a few reasons why the statistic is sobering and very disappointing, but behind it lies a much more important set of stories.
Thank you so much. It's In a way, I think it's very interesting because you also mentioned at the beginning about the post-war Japanese recovery episode, and I want to come back to that. But in a way, pandemic also, as the global crisis, sort of brought us together to think about innovative ways to tackle these shared common threats. So you have that, so again, shared experiences of surviving together on the one hand, but as you said during your speech, we all have seen the polarizations, social divisions, political divisions within domestically and also among countries. How do we reverse that, the democratic paradox that you mentioned? How do we reverse this inward-looking, very competitive political climate at the moment to go back to the let's survive this together conversation?
Well, if I had a simple answer to that, maybe I would not be sitting here today, but running a very big think tank that earns a lot of money. But I would suggest that perhaps when we sometimes discuss what is happening in the sphere of international relations and the way that also multilateralism is working today, what we're actually falling victim to is we're being distracted by the symptoms rather than the causes. And this is a little bit too simplistic, but actually a great deal of the origins of what is going wrong with multilateralism can actually be found in domestic politics. It is an era where, oddly enough, after the 1990s, the end of the Cold War, we thought we would move into an era, remember the end of history and many of these other analogies that were used, where we no longer have the great system power rivalry, where the world could concentrate on shared objectives. And yet, just a few years later, we have this extraordinary large power rivalry. We have within our societies this extraordinary phenomenon of polarization and of radicalization, the center ground in politics being lost. And in part, I think the United Nations has been neglected since the Cold War. I think most member states thought, well, yes, we have the United Nations, but actually we are living in an era where it's not as relevant anymore. So its institutions, its political processes really were the product of benign neglect. At the same time, a great deal of what was happening in our societies around the world was a growing sense of frustration among citizens, between elites and citizens, between an economic system that was increasingly dictating the terms on which you had to operate if you wanted to be part of this liberalized global economy. Remember, many of even the Scandinavian countries who had for a long time created a social and economic model that was based on high taxation, highest public service, suddenly had to abandon a lot of that in order to be able to be a competitive economy. The transatlantic economy, and Japan in a sense belongs to that world as well, suddenly dictated that, you know, this is how you have to run your economies. So we have created today in many countries a growing number of people who feel that they are losers in this new world, while there is a liberal elite and increasingly also an economic elite that lives almost in a parallel world. Now, to cut a long story short, a lot of these tensions have led to increasingly politically agitated discourses in our countries, and suddenly, you know, migration, the person who is coming into your country becomes an object of political combat. Your neighboring country becomes a way of dividing your society. If you are in Washington today and you talk about China, if you are in Tokyo today and you talk about China, there is very little in the first reaction that would assume that there is scope for cooperation. It's competition and even conflict. So I think we now find ourselves at a moment in time where the institutions and the rationale for international cooperation are increasingly being instrumentalized. Development cooperation in the US, in Europe, is today weaponized in the domestic political battle between right and left. And this is something I think we need to acknowledge in order to be able to find a way forward. And I think it begins by, first of all, challenging the misleading and deliberately misinforming narratives that are there. Secondly, by reminding people what actually they have always felt, that they have empathy. People who fled Syria did not flee because they wanted to get out of Damascus and live in some very, poor neighborhood in Brussels or in London or in Paris. They fled what you have just seen on television over the last week, the most horrendous regime, torturing, killing, and locking up its own people. That empathy at that moment to help Syrians survive has been turned and has turned into something very different. So finally, I think we also have to rediscover in the hearts and minds of our public a narrative that allows them to see that actually development can work. Why am I paying taxes to help somebody far away if it doesn't even work? And here we have sometimes been the cause of a great deal of misunderstanding. Development has actually been the most remarkable success story of the 20th century, whether in terms of science, economics, technology. 1995, 15 million people had access to broadband internet. Come 2025, 6 billion people will have access to broadband and internet. Now, this isn't somehow falling from heaven. This is development, this is investment, this is technology, it's infrastructure. And I think we need to celebrate some of these victories, including eradication of diseases, that people take for granted and therefore think that development is a failure and everybody is increasingly in conflict and competition with one another. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. I'd like to pick on the two things that you mentioned just now. The one is the misinformation, disinformation, and second, technology. And I think these two are very much related, and it's very relevant to the generation that's sitting here, the university and beyond. With the AI and rapidly advancing technology, and I think can go either way. Again, feeding the mistrust and misinformation, disinformation. At the same time, it's probably also going to be a critical tool for development as well. How do you see development shaping in the more advanced technological society?
I think in some ways we should always acknowledge that technology as a disruptor and technology as a means to do good or to do bad or evil is not a new phenomenon. And I think we need to now recognize what is perhaps something that we can draw on from history. How do we deal with it? And what is new? And I think what is perhaps most challenging about this whole frontier of digital AI, and behind that also now quantum computing, is the sheer scale and pace of changing the realm of possibility. Every aspect of development, whether in Japan or somewhere in Jamaica or in Botswana or in Beijing or in Berlin, will be different as a result of what will happen in the next few years. AI fundamentally changes the realm of possibility. I just learned last week that with AI, we can probably better predict the ability of, or the impact of weather on power transmission lines. By having that capacity, we can increase most of the time by 50% the amount of power that can be transmitted through these power transmission lines, fundamentally changing the economics of large-scale grids, for example, regional energy grids that allow renewable energy to be deployed. But also research, particularly in the university, whether it is the medical sciences, even econometric modeling, we can just envisage this extraordinary realm of possibility. And it is one reason why UNDP has not only embraced digital already since a number of years, and we are heavily engaged in helping developing countries understand that the rails and roads and bridges of the 18th and 19th century are today the digital public infrastructure, the fiber optic cables, the affordability of access to broadband and internet, because they will define whether you are a country with opportunity to develop or whether you will be an economy left behind. Now, where the challenge, I think, is often debated today, how do we protect ourselves from the abuse of these technologies? And here there is an interesting debate, which came out a few years ago in the Secretary General commissioned the panel. And basically what the panel said is, why is it that we have spent the better part of 80 years or 75 years at the time developing fundamental human rights, legislation and norms to protect children, women, minorities from discrimination and attack and abuse. And suddenly, because we move from analog to digital, all this doesn't count anymore, because we have this myth of the internet should be unencumbered and government should not regulate it. And how can modern human trafficking, child pornography, sexual abuse ever be considered something that should be legal on the internet? And here, I think, comes this first barrier we have to break through. Yes, we may have a different technology platform, but it doesn't change the fundamental underlying ethics, including the role of government to protect citizens. Now, it is more difficult in a world where, a cyber universe is global, but that is why you saw, interestingly enough, just a few months ago, for the first time, the world turning to the United Nations, surprisingly, because 10 years ago, if you had said that anything to do with digital or the internet would ever look to multilateralism, people would have laughed. Now we had first the US, then China introduce a General Assembly resolution. Typically China and the US, they had to do two instead of doing one together, but that's, dynamics of politics. But then in the Summit of the Future, and as Pact of the Future, a whole digital compact emerged, giving essentially the United Nations a significant role in helping the world shape the guardrails for how this new universe would develop. And I think therein lies part of the answer to your question. We will continue to develop norms, we will continue to develop laws that are meant to protect without preventing the use of this technology. And UNDP's role essentially is to help countries do both, maximize and accelerate the readiness to use this extraordinary opportunity, but never at the cost of not having a digital ecosystem that is also rooted in a deep understanding of fundamental human rights and the rights of citizens, including the protection of vulnerable groups.
Thank you so much for those insights. I would love to hear from students and those who are interested in the future of development cooperation. But before I do that, let me actually get the time frame right so that you can start thinking about questions. Wonderful. I'll have one or two more questions to continue with the dialogue, but please start thinking about questions to ask. Switching gears a little bit, sorry, your speech kind of inspired me to ask this question. Again, you started with our own history, the recovery of Japan after the World War II, and now thinking about the reconstruction requirements that we are facing today. Back then, we had a Marshall Plan, we had the world coming together to help us recover. But now you are facing reconstruction of Ukraine, Syria, and hopefully eventually Gaza. How would you deal with this massively different context of reconstruction?
I think, first of all, let us acknowledge it is an enormous task in financial terms. I mean, just thinking of Ukraine, if there was indeed some form of political settlement and we could move from the current emergency response to a recovery and reconstruction pathway, it would be tens of billions of dollars. Now, what we often forget is that even in the past, the way we use public finance or grants and such resources has always attracted private sector investment. In fact, in our global economy today, in every national economy, public budgets account for maybe 10, 15, sometimes 20% of GDP. The rest is all private finance, whether it is held by banking institutions, investment funds, or under your mattress or in savings. And so if you look at post-war reconstruction, whether let's take Japan and Germany, there was a massive injection of public finance, but at the end of the day, the post-war economies of Japan and Germany were built by private sector investments. And today we often talk about startups, but the fact is that the great corporations of Japan today were startups then. And I think in that sense, what we perhaps are doing more deliberately today is to figure out how do you leverage public finance in order to leverage a greater amount of private finance, and not only for the sake of profit-making investors, but also to deliver public goods. And if you look at the internet today, the so-called highways and railways and bridges of our modern economy, we have become fairly clever. Government issues licenses, private operators bid, sometimes millions, sometimes billions of dollars or yen are raised as revenue, and it is the private sector that is investing in this, but the public sector regulates and also creates public goods. For instance, where the private sector would not normally go, fiber optic cables are today still installed in order to ensure inclusiveness in our societies. So I think the ability to think of that financing as always having been a hybrid is very important. And then suddenly in a world of 450 or more trillion dollars, this is roughly the global wealth. I don't know if anybody can really estimate it, but just to give you an order of magnitude, then suddenly being able to mobilize these amounts of money is not impossible. But perhaps what we are losing right now is that wisdom of doing so. And I used this afternoon at the anniversary for the 70 years of Japanese Development Corporation, the example that to me is so intriguing. What is it that an American president could tell his citizens 1 or 2 years after the end of the Second World War that made them be willing to have $100 billion, that's roughly the equivalent value of the Marshall Plan in today's money, to mobilize $100 billion of American taxpayers' money to invest in the reconstruction of Germany, and in fact, in Japan, an analogous investment. The country that had lost its sons in the wars against Germany and Japan, able to have the wisdom to say, we must now use our money to invest in our enemy's recovery. And then we come to a meeting such as the climate conference in Baku, where we end up haggling, and I know it sounds a little bit odd, over $200 or $300 billion. Colleagues, do you know how much the world will invest in energy infrastructure this year? The IEA, International Energy Agency, roughly estimates that in 2024, the world will invest $3 trillion, in new electricity generating infrastructure. So just one sector, $3 trillion. And $2 trillion of those dollars are in fact now invested in renewable energy infrastructure. So we are already in the midst of an energy revolution. Our global economy is able to mobilize, even now already, $3 trillion, but we cannot find a way in which the wealthiest countries can mobilize $300 billion to help us prevent potentially the biggest disaster to development in human history, climate change. So these are the contradictions, and I often ask myself, were people so much wiser in 1947, 48 than they are in 2024? Or what has changed? And what would allow us, to your question earlier on, to come back to an age where wealthy countries say maybe, just maybe, the ratio of 200 billion to 2,400 billion, remember ODA, military defense investments, is not the right ratio. And we need to rethink, we need to have a debate in our societies. And I think that might ultimately lead to a very different way of investing in that kind of transition.
Thank you so much. It's such a rich answer that I'm still, deciphering how to take this forward. I think one quick question, and that's actually a segue to Q&A. You mentioned this, the public commitment, also private sector enthusiasm, and then the potential. In fact, a lot of Hitotsubashi students go to, those who are interested in development either go to JICA for public sector opportunities to be engaged in development. They also go to startups, also consulting firms, the private sector side. So for those who are interested in joining the development cooperation opportunities, whether it's public or private, do you have any advice, message, things that they should consider doing, skills that they should develop?
Well, let me first of all start by saying you're most welcome to apply to jobs in UNDP, because your government is always very concerned that we do not have more Japanese nationals, although I then always tell them actually UNDP is better than many of our sister agencies. We have a lot of Japanese nationals, but it is an interesting question because I think development cooperation is often viewed also in Japan and in other countries as an extension of being a public civil servant, when actually 90% of our staff are not necessarily traditional public civil servants. They are experts in technology, in economics, in digital or in health. They are also innovators. Much of the 23,000 people that work for UNDP in these 170 countries, they are somewhere between a startup mentality and we have no answer before, so let's develop the answer together. And I think a modern development organization like UNDP today is essentially a learning organization in a much more intense way than we may have said in the past. So the first thing I think you have to embrace is that you're not joining a civil service. You're actually joining a kind of distributed startup operation that succeeds in part because of the way it connects to people within national administration, but also national economies that are driving change. We invested in UNDP a few years ago in establishing what we called accelerator labs in almost 100 countries, where we literally tried to turn the logic of innovation and development thinking upside down. Because remember, traditionally, development was about bringing experts, bringing technology, bringing money, and then development would happen. In today's world, UNDP, first of all, is looking at innovation from within a country. So our accelerator labs were exclusively attached to our offices, not as the great innovation gurus, but as a capacity to study innovation within the country. And you know, it is remarkable what you find when you look. In the heart of Africa, some of the most transformative financial inclusion platforms in the world are operating today. Not in Tokyo, not even in California, not in Berlin or London, but in the heart of the African continent, because the way that technology could help you solve the problem of not having a banking system is phenomenal. Some of you may have heard of the zip line in Rwanda. A few years ago, I remember meeting these entrepreneurs who came with the idea that we will bring drones to Africa, and with the drones we can deliver vital medicines and so on. And I thought, you know, I love people with vision and imagination, but these guys really have gone too far right now. Last year, I went to Kigali, and outside of Kigali, there is a drone airport today with digital technology that is connected to every single health center in the country. And any doctor can call that drone airport and say, I have a woman in my hospital who is giving birth, I need blood plasma, or I need some other emergency drug. A QR code is printed out. The medicine is put in a plastic bag. It is attached to a small drone about 1 meter in width. The drone takes off, flies to any health center in the country, drops the medicine and comes back. All this within 30 to 40 minutes. This is happening in Africa today. So I think we need to, in a sense, imagine this realm of possibility as being so powerful now that we are able to overcome those limitations that often were deemed absolute. If you're a poor country, high tech is not for you. Actually, in the digital age, the opposite seems to have happened.
Completely agree, because I don't think we have the system in Japan, actually. Seriously. Okay, I'd like to actually open the floor for the questions and answers for dialogue. Students, I see one hand up over here and one hand over. Okay, let's go. Let's take 1, 2, 3, and then we'll do another round.
So you talk a lot about the benefits from technological development, et cetera, and we've seen lots of iterations of this. If you go back to 1846 when the tractor was invented, but the issue to me is the dispersion of technology rather than the development itself. I think the development outstrips the dispersion. Taking the tractor example again, by the turn of the century, only 4% of farms actually used a tractor. And we've gone through many iterations of this. We've seen first with the tractor and then so on with the internet. Productivity never actually got boosted by these technological developments. So why are we investing so much in the technology rather than the dispersion? What can the UN do to ensure that dispersion is actually realized and that we can actually see the benefits of these technologies?
Thank you, good question. I'm gonna take 1 or 2 more, but before I do that, actually, can I ask you guys to identify yourself so that we know who you are?
I'm Zach Prentice. I'm an undergraduate student at Waseda.
Waseda, okay, wonderful. Okay, and we had one hand up. Okay, here, yeah, with the blue shirt. Yeah. Okay.
I'm undergraduate student in a major university studying politics and the immigrations. Yes, thank you so much.
And which question? Your question?
Question. Sorry. So, first of all,
That's a statement.
so, yeah, sorry for my English. And then first, actually I had 2 questions. One is I'm studying immigration, political study, and then I thought that immigration will be more significantly important in the 21st century. But actually, over the countries, all of the Latin America or America or the Europe doesn't like to take immigrants anymore, and then every country is becoming block and block. So that I don't know if the immigration will be more active in the after 21 centuries. So that I want to have some idea about this phenomenon, about the blocks and the immigration. And second question is, do you think the cooperation among the country without any understanding each other's profit or among the border will be possible? I don't think if I said right, but yeah, sorry.
I'm not sure I got the second question. So
yes,
can you repeat the second question?
Do you think the corporations among the country without any benefits, maybe some country will get benefits, some country will not gonna benefit, and then another country will gonna against it because they don't get any profit from it. For example, the UK said stop devastating the forests in Latin America, but there seems like no, we're just gonna use some fuels and then we're gonna develop our country like you did. And then so all the SDGs or the goals of the world is not going right now. So that I want to have some idea about this question too. Thank you so much.
One hand up. Okay, let's go.
Thank you. I'm Kautar Feka. I'm an international student at the Graduate Law School of Hitotsubashi. And my question, first of all, thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting, and I'm sure this inspired for several interesting points of discussion. And my question today is, how can the UNDP balance the urgency of immediate response to global crisis with the need to build long-term solutions without risking perpetuating economic or social dependencies in developing countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, wonderful questions.
You say it's, I would say, tough questions, yeah. This is the examiner and this is the victim, but no, let me repeat the compliment. Very, very relevant question. So dispersion, or I would say inclusion, is another way of describing perhaps what you're referring to. And I think if you look at the history of technology, diffusion or dispersion, I think you called it, for many technologies, actually it's a positive story, right? The question is, did it happen fast enough? Now, you are perhaps too young. Some of you are older. You will remember that when cell phones first appeared, it was the people in a Jaguar and a Mercedes or a very expensive Lexus that used to drive past you with a brick next to their ear, right? That was the era when cellular telephony was the privilege of the few. I remember coming to work on one of my first assignments on the African continent around the late 80s and 1990s. And, you know, we were talking about digital exclusion and the idea that you would invest in development terms in actually using computers and software was criticized by some because it basically was viewed as an investment that would benefit the elites, the urban centers, but not the citizens of a country. And what would have been the conclusion? Don't bring computers to Africa because some will use them first and then others later. That is not the conclusion. And I mean, if you today are in Kenya and you see how people operate of smartphones and 90% of the population, adult population, has access to a smartphone as a platform on which to transact, then perhaps the lesson, and this is really at the core of what I believe we have been trying to do in UNDP in the last few years, is to understand the significance of technology and then to shorten the time period and the cost of making that technology relevant and accessible to a country as soon as possible. And some of that has to do with policy choices. The term digital public infrastructure is not an accidental term. One of the lessons we have learned from countries is that if governments do not invest in that kind of public infrastructure, it will take far longer for the poorer or the more distant parts of the population to have access to it. So taking a fiber optic cable outside of the capital city and taking it in a country on the African continent to provincial towns is the smartest investment you can make, because you are creating access to a global economy at the place where people live, rather than forcing young men and women having to leave their families, their towns, and move to the cities where they end up living in slums with all the consequences. So why not connect a rural economy to a 21st century economy marketplace, and suddenly a hybrid livelihood is perfectly feasible. So I would argue much of our work as a development agency, a public entity, is precisely to figure out how do we accelerate dispersion, how do we maximize inclusion. And if you look at digital today, and you are interested in women and finance and gender inequality in our financial system, but even for poor people in general, 15 years ago, the front door of any bank was closed to you. You didn't have assets, you didn't have a credit record, you had nothing to offer. You would not be welcome in the financial system institutions of our time. Here comes digital finance platforms, and suddenly hundreds of women, hundreds of millions of women are able for the first time in their lives to be active participants in a financial system where they can save money, where they can borrow money at almost no cost in terms of the transaction cost, buy their produce in a wholesale market in the morning, take it to their village, sell it, and repay the loan in the evening. This is what I think you are referring to, and what we need to figure out is how do we maximize the inclusion design factor in these technologies, and how do we shorten the periods. So a tractor may not always be something that everybody needs to own, because most people's fields are too small to maybe make mechanized agriculture happen. So here comes a second order choice. Do we consolidate? I mean, is large-scale farming the only answer? People often forget that close to 60 to 70%, I think, still of all the food produced in the world is not produced by mega farming corporations. It's small-scale farmers. But our entire agricultural industrial complex, let me call it that for a moment, is geared around the large-scale commercial farming economy, not the small-scale farmer. These are where economies go wrong, and where they are not invested in people, they're invested in a second-order economy, which is where do you maximize profits, economies of scale, etc. To your point, on immigration, I think it is one of the ironies that we live now in the 21st century, but if you are the holder of the wrong passport, travel is worse than it was in the 19th century. If you are part of a region in the world that is not welcome in another part of the world, sometimes it has to do with refugee flows, sometimes it's your religion. Remember, we're about to see an administration return in the United States that in its first days of President Trump's first administration declared citizens of a particular group of countries of a particular faith non-welcome in the United States. So I think one thing we have to understand is why has immigration, why has migration become such a controversy? And I think there we have to look more at how the countries that are, let's say, at the end of a migration movement, overwhelmed, maybe not rationally, but they are overwhelmed by a sense of people from somewhere else coming here. And, you know, whether it's economics or not economics, doesn't really matter. You are entering into my space. And I think we have all underestimated that phenomenon and have not addressed it openly enough. And I think we will always continue to see migration. I mean, human history is a history of migration, but in today's world, you know, you can migrate not just with a few people on a horse that, you know, arrives after 3 months. You can have thousands of people flying. I mean, if you look at the migration in the Americas right now, it's extraordinary. I mean, it's not South Americans only, it's Somalis, Indians, Afghans, who now fly into Central America and then migrate from there. So globalization has also unfortunately happened in the whole human people smuggling business. And I think we need to understand how societies are reacting to that. But what is so tragic is that it is at the same time being mixed up with fundamental rights of protection. Refugees have always enjoyed a fundamental commitment to protecting them. And that is now being questioned, and that is being eroded. And I think for the international rule of law, for humanitarian principles, this is going to be a very tough moment. And you know, when you start seeing a country like the UK paying Rwanda to take refugees, Australia locking up people in offshore islands for years, I mean, we are displaying a degree of desperation at the moment that actually does not give any reason to be proud of this. And the migration compact, you know, that the United Nations was negotiating was an attempt to create legal pathways for migration. Because the irony is that the country I come from, in Germany now, has, you know, hundreds of thousands of migrants that are essentially in the review process because they are likely to be illegal migrants. Now, the extraordinary thing that is happening, while tens of thousands of them sit in these buildings and camps and await their review, German ministers are flying to the very same countries to recruit people who will drive buses in Germany, will be nurses, and need to be brought into Germany. Now, this is the craziness of our migration system, immigration system in today's world. Last point that you raised, And now I have to just remind myself, you had asked, can you just briefly just shout out what your question was? Sorry. Just the headline.
It was about how to promote development without causing the social and economic exclusion. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Right. In a way, I think your answer to the first question sort of, hit some of the points.
I was thinking about the dependency from an economic and social point of view for undeveloped countries.
Very important question, because we have celebrated globalization and interdependence for quite a few decades now, the World Trade Organization, and the extraordinary economic growth we have seen, including in countries that have been true beneficiaries from being trading nations and having specialized in, the old theories of labor is cheaper, therefore you can export, and have done very well. So I think dependency in the 21st century needs to be re-examined from the point of view of what is mutually beneficial dependency. Trying to be food self-sufficient when your average rainfall in your country is less than 400 millimeters and you're an arid to semi-arid part of the world is not necessarily the most rational way to think about not being dependent on food imports from somewhere else. Now, dependencies create vulnerabilities, and how we deal with that obviously is an important part of mitigating the risks. But I think the dependency you are referring to is, let's say, a more negative dependency, right? Where exploitation or unequal terms of trade or these elements define a relationship that is essentially unequal and ultimately unfair or exploitative. And I think this is again where multilateralism has played such an important role. We are the platform which countries negotiate the way we trade with one another. There are many elements within the WTO that are about discriminatory measures that are taken by countries and therefore unfair in the way that they impose conditions on developing countries. But now we reach a dilemma. We have climate change, we have to decarbonize. Is Europe's CBAM, basically the border adjustment mechanism that will charge higher import tariffs on countries that are not decarbonizing when they actually export their products into the European Union? Developing countries rightly are saying this is discriminatory. Europeans are saying, well, you can't ask us to spend a lot of money decarbonizing and then some other country just continues to produce the same product and is able to basically outcompete us because they are not paying the price of a clean energy matrix. So we live in a very complex world. So when I was saying earlier on, if you want to work in development cooperation in today's world, it is not, single solutions anymore. We are talking about complex systems management that is not only about maximizing GDP growth, it's also about sustainability and about equity. Much of UNDP's work is precisely at that intersection. How do we help countries to recognize that the global economy does carry opportunities for them, but how do they negotiate their own national strategies in order to not become exploitative in the way they trade or dependent in a way that undermines their own ability? There is no simple answer, and frankly, in some respects, we are still seeing some extraordinarily unequal relationships in that global economy.
Thank you. I'll have two more questions maybe from this side. Let's go back to all the way back. And then let's see.
I am an undergraduate student from Waseda. First of all, I'm honored to be able to be given this opportunity. So my question revolves around, in the past decade, we have seen a very much a politicization of aid, as aid given traditional aid providers such as Japan or the US be lost out in favor of new aid providers such as China or India, who have different methodologies of providing aid and different ways of assessing aid. And we have also seen the aid itself become a very political matter, where politicians in the recipient countries are using the topic of aid in order to push their own agendas. And this has created many conflicts around the idea of the development itself. What can the UN do in order to smooth out this process and make aid once again about cooperation and not conflict?
Thank you. My name is Toshi Nakamura. I'm a formerly UNDP staff member and currently running my own organization in Indonesia. My question is a little bit more personal. Given the myriad of responsibilities that UNDP plays, what has been the most difficult decisions that you had to make in the last 7 years or so as the administrator? Thank you.
I would love to hear that answer to myself, actually. So one last question. Okay, go back.
Good evening. I'm Afra, and I'm from Waseda University. I'm an econ major. I'd like to thank Hitatsubashi for this opportunity. So my question goes to the fact that there is often a disconnect between global policymaking and the diverse realities on the ground. How does UNDP ensure its innovative solutions are both adaptable and to hyper-local contexts, and so it is also scalable, and while maintaining alignment with global sustainability goals? Thank you.
Wow, very impressed. So we have about 5 minutes left in total for the...
So, quick response on what can the UN, what can multilateralism or also UNDP do about aid as either a mutually beneficial transaction or, again, in the terms of dependency or otherwise, also in the geopolitical landscape that you were referring to. I think it's, first of all, worth noting that in the way that the OECD and the DAC guidelines have also created transparency, has certainly helped to make aid less of an manipulative instrument. By manipulative, I mean pretending to be one thing but actually being another. Now, let us be clear. I mean, aid is not only an act of charity, it is, and I would actually advocate for that, an investment. The question is the investment mutually beneficial, or is it just about getting my company to export something and then, you know, basically get that revenue, never mind what it does at the other end? And I think this is where we should recognize that, you know, developing countries today are not developing countries of 30 years ago. I mean, in many of the countries we work, there are leaders in public institutions in the private sector who can very well determine whether an offer is an offer that is worthwhile or not. Now, obviously, for countries that are either coming out of a crisis, are extremely poor, are small economies, sometimes it is much more difficult to say no to something. And I think this is where multilateralism, and this is why also UNDP is an institution that in its 59th year, in some ways is in more demand than it was, because we are to some extent an institution that is principally there to advise and assist the developing country in its relations, whether with traditional donors or with Chinese donors. And I can speak here with very clear and direct examples. We are sometimes pushed very hard by traditional donors to impose certain conditions. And we push back because UNDP's principle of being engaged in a country is not to come with an agenda that is set, but it is the UN's most generous offer to a country. How can we help you? We do not work in any country around the world that does not invite UNDP. And I say this because I used to be head of the United Nations Environment Program. UNEP had a different logic. UNEP is a platform which the world agrees on global environmental norms and standards, and UNEP then tries to persuade countries and supports them in enacting them. UNDP is an organization that literally says, how can we help you in your national development? What are your priorities? And that's a remarkably important way of engaging. And it allows us to also say, when China, for example, says, why is UNDP not promoting Belt and Road investments more, or the Global Development Initiative? We have a very simple way of responding. Our responsibility is to advise a country what are its best options, not to promote one country's export of a particular product or a particular offer. Now, having said that, don't misunderstand me. I have seen wind power farms built and financed by China that are as good as any European or American wind power farm. This demonization that we see happening right now between China's investments in developing countries and OECD DAC investments, you have to look much deeper and much more carefully in order to reach a judgment. And I think the great prize of development cooperation in the next few years will be when we manage to bring all the development assets, whether they are American, European, Japanese, Australian, or Chinese, or Indian, into a format where the interests of the country to whom these resources are being either lent or granted is actually the interest of that country in a partnership with those who finance aid. And part of our role is precisely to promote that kind of relationship. So I think that's on the aid side. What has been the most difficult decision? Sometimes asking our staff to stay in places that are very dangerous to operate from. And UNDP today is an organization that is deeply committed to the principle of staying and delivering. We do not believe that it is the right thing to do when a war breaks out or conflicts are there, that we suspend development and that we say, well, this is now humanitarian, let's put this country on a drip and we'll provide food and so on, but we will come back when things are better. During COVID, we did not close a single office or operation of UNDP anywhere in the world. That was the most difficult decision from a duty of care point of view, because that was the moment when countries needed us most. And the extraordinary thing is that, for reasons I cannot quite explain to you, but you may know it better as a former member of UNDP, we attract people who have such a deep sense of conviction and passion for what they do, that they will actually stay and be there for people. I mean, I had colleagues who were in Yemen during the pandemic who for 3 months could not be evacuated. There was no flight in the northern part of Yemen. We could not even do medic evacuations if our staff members contracted COVID. When we asked our colleagues who would want to leave, they didn't leave. So that decision at that moment in time to sustain not just a principle, but actually then to ask our colleagues to live it in practice, even at the risk of losing some of them, is perhaps the most difficult thing when you are the head of an organization. And 23,000 people with their families and dependents, that's a large number of people. So I would say that was, for me, the most difficult decision. The rest is more a matter of how do you prioritize and how do you make choices, because I may be the administrator, which is an odd title to have, as you can imagine, but as the head of an organization, at the end of the day, an organization looks to you to make decisions, right? And I'm not more intelligent than any of my colleagues, but I carry the responsibility and the accountability for making decisions. And I think that's the second part that is tough when you're at the top, in inverted commas. It's fascinating, I love it, it's interesting, but at the end of the day, I also have to embrace the responsibility to make choices, even though sometimes I am not sure what is the right choice. And that is then the art of management. What is collective intelligence? How do you best move people around you into a position where they're not lobbying you, but they're actually helping you to think through options? So I would say these are two examples. And where was our third colleague? At the back. You see, I'm always struggling with the third question.
The local context, yeah?
Yes. No, actually, it was a great question which to end, because one reason I love working with UNDP is that it is perhaps one of the most extraordinary illustrations of how an organization can be locally focused and yet globally relevant. Why do I say that? Because UNDP in a country is still an international organization, and to grassroots workers it may seem far away. But we have our work, our projects, and there are roughly 4,000 on average projects that we manage in 170 countries, we are in touch with those countries. We have people, we have partners, our fingers on the pulse of national development thinking, national decision making. It's an extraordinary way of connecting, first of all, local perspectives, but then we are also the United Nations Development Program. I go straight from listening about the impact of the debt crisis in a country such as Kenya or Zambia or Ethiopia to being the representative of the United Nations on the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. I walk into that meeting and I speak to this reality that they do not wish to see. Because in the G20, it's the stability of the global financial system that is the self-interest. The fact that there are hundreds of millions of people who are not able to invest in their development right now because of the way that debt has accumulated and is not being addressed is a voice that very few institutions can bring there. And UNDP is one of them. And a last example is to do with climate change. We are helping roughly 120 countries right now around the world to prepare their nationally determined contributions. You know, next year, the Paris Agreement will have its next big test. If we cannot demonstrate a ratcheting up of ambition in this 5-year cycle, why have a Paris Agreement? So being engaged at the grassroots level of a country thinking through its options, but then being able to connect this also to having the mosaic of national climate plans and the extraordinary initiatives that are now underway. Few people realize when we go to these COPs that it is in the developing world today that the greatest responses to climate change are actually happening. Not just China. I mean, China is in a league of its own. I think I read just now that this year it will pass the 500 gigawatt installed wind capacity, which is the equivalent of the whole rest of the world put together. But it's not just China. It's actually India. India will construct in the next 4 years another 300 gigawatts of solar and wind power. This has never been done before, not even by China. Who is talking about this? Who is recognizing that here is a major developing country that is investing massively in the decarbonization of its energy system? And you know what? Neither China nor India are actually beneficiaries in any significant way of this global climate finance. They are financing this out of their own public and private sectors, which is another strange distortion in our debates when we talk about climate finance. So this is what I see in a sense as being the DNA of UNDP. 90%, more than 90% of our staff are in country. We are a decentralized operation. We are deeply embedded in the national development ecosystem. And in many countries for 30, 40 years, we are part of that. But we have this extraordinary benefit and advantage of being connected also to the United Nations, where the Secretary General, where colleagues from UNDP can literally address a global audience and say, we have to act on these issues. So I feel very comfortable with that challenge that you posed, but not complacent. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing those perspectives. And I saw so many more hands, and I'm so sorry that we're running out of time. So this is a plea for you to come back and speak to us again, because I think there's just so much interest in the room, and I find it also very heartwarming actually to hear so many great student conversations and questions. So thank you, and joining me, please join me for a round of applause for Mr. Steiner, for those.
シュタイナー総裁、中谷講師、大変丁寧かつ力のこもった対談をありがとうございました。どうぞフロアの席にお戻りください。会場の皆様からも大変活発な質問をいただきまして感謝申し上げます。それでは最後にハジャリッチ秀子 UNDP 駐日代表に閉会の挨拶をお願いしたいと思います。ハジャリッチ駐日代表、よろしくお願いいたします。
中野学長、そして中谷先生、そして大林先生、中村講師、 そして学生の皆様、ご来賓の皆様、本日は一橋と UNDP の共催イベント、2030年に向けて持続可能な未来のための創造的アプローチについてのイベントにご参加くださり、皆様に深く御礼申し上げます。ちょっと後でですね、英語に切り替えるんですけども、ちょっと総裁の私の上司の話をしたくてですね2日間ぐらい一緒に友をしたんですけども、昨日は朝8時から始まって、でメディアのインタビューが終わったのが夜の10時半と。でね、それはもちろん頭もいいし体力もある。でもそれだけじゃないんですよね。もうひしひしと感じたのはこの信念、このままだったらいけない、変えないといけない、コネクトしないといけないっていうそのパッションがね、とっても感じたんですよね。ですから今日も皆さんも元気づけられたと思いますし、で私たちもこういうふうに学生さんと一緒に交流ができたっていうことは非常に光栄に思ってます。早稲田大学の学生さんも結構いらっしゃったみたいで、結構二平さんのネットワークでしょうかね、うちのスタッフなんですけども。So this event was held at an important milestone of Japan's 70th anniversary of international development cooperation. And as the administrators highlighted, that we are at an inflection point for sustainable development in a world punctuated by conflicts and polarization and threats of climate change, which creeps into our livelihood and our planet, at times violently or silently. So UNDP, as mentioned, that we have offices in 170 countries. In Ukraine, for example, we have 420 staff members. Many of them, many of our offices, they are national officers, and they are our biggest assets and then wisdom as well. So today, Akim talked about accelerate our lives. And let me quote, the MIT Sloan Management Review once said it. Under the leadership of Akim Steiner, UNDP has been learning and creating a new organizational structure to more effectively and efficiently ramp up its efforts in the area of sustainable development with a network of local innovators called Accelerator Labs, unquote. So it has been quite a shift, and we really value the innovations. And humility and agility to adjust ourselves to fast evolving environment is constant. And there's no end point for such a journey. Together with you, we are determined to continue to work together to transform from planning to practice and innovation to impact. So Japan and many countries, our partnerships are so profound, and for us, Japan is more than being a donor, but an indispensable development partner to jointly engage policy advocacy and enabling us to take action on the ground. As highlighted at today's discussion, our mission is to connect the dots to find solutions together. We build partnerships that connect experiences and innovations, both tangible and intangible, to find sustainable development solutions. In closing, I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude for Hitotsubashi University, as well as Joshukai, the alumni organization of the university, which provided enormous support. And also to my dear colleagues at UNDP. 本日は最後までご清聴ありがとうございました。
梶谷リッチ駐日代表、失礼しました。ご挨拶ありがとうございました。それでは、ここから、シュタイナー、UNDP 総裁、梶谷リッチ駐日代表、中野学長、中谷講師が、会場から退出をされます。皆様拍手でお送りください。ありがとうございました。それでは本日の UNDP 総裁講演会はこれで終了となります。講演のご清聴と活発な質疑へのご参加、誠にありがとうございました。皆様道中お気をつけてお帰りください。